I'm thrilled to introduce Michael to you. Michael Mauboussin is Chief Investment Strategist at Legg Mason Capital Management. He's also an adjunct professor of finance at Columbia Business School. And he is the author of More Than You Know, and also co-author of Expectations Investing. His most recent book, Think Twice, is what he'll be sharing with us this afternoon. So I hope you will join me in giving a warm welcome to Michael Mauboussin.
Thank you, Crystal. Good afternoon. That was a wonderful introduction and a lot of good thought-provoking stuff. As you gathered, I'm a guy from the world of finance, so I'm not really from the same world as you, and I was thinking to myself whether my ideas or these ideas would be of relevance to you, and I was thinking about that old Sesame Street segment. One of these things is not like the others. One of these things doesn't belong, so if you're asking which one is not like the others, that would be me. I'd like to do three things. First, I want to give you just a very quick snippet of what Think Twice is all about. Second, I want to walk through three of the mistakes. Crystal touched on some of these issues, but three of the mistakes specifically, and hopefully you'll see the links to the world of philanthropy. And then we'll open up. Crystal and I have we had a great discussion at lunchtime, and there are a lot of interesting topics and lots of different directions we can go. So what is Think Twice all about? The idea is relatively straightforward. Is that when we are faced with certain situations, our minds will naturally go down one path when the right way to think about the problem is a different path. And by the way, this is going to be completely natural and innate, and that we all do this. Incidentally, smart people do it, not as smart people do it, we all do it. So I'm going to give you a very concrete example of this to try to bring it to life. I'm going to show you in a few seconds a math problem. I'll ask you to calculate the answer in your mind. Please don't shout out the answer, because there might be some smarty pants that does that. Just keep the answer to yourself, and we'll see how it goes. So here's the math problem. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Right? Jeopardy music, Jeopardy music, Jeopardy music. Okay, hopefully you all have that problem solved. The answer, of course, is 5 cents. But if you're like a normal person, you either answered 10 cents, or 10 cents was the first number that presented itself in your mind. Show of hands, how many people are in the 10-cent group? Yeah, raise them high, be proud, right? That's the whole point. Now, it can't be 10 cents, of course. The answer has to be 5 cents, because 10 cents and the bat costs $1 more, it's $1.10, and 10 cents plus $1.10 is $1.20. It's got to be 5 cents plus $1.05 is $1.10. By the way, the reason I laboriously go through that math is I gave this slide I was giving this presentation to the senior management team of a company, and I just zipped through the rest of the presentation, and then we had a great Q&A session, and then we were at the wine and cheese reception. This is like an hour later, and the head of marketing shuffles up to me. He's like, "Hey, dude, can you go back through that bat and ball thing one more time?" Like, make sure we're all on the same page here. So this is, we're going to be faced with kinds of situations that will be like the bat and ball problem. An answer will present itself to you, and it will not be the right way to think about that. So let me share three specific mistakes, and I'm hopeful you'll see the links, perhaps, to the world that you're in. Let me start with the first mistake, with the story of the racehorse Big Brown. And having just run the Kentucky Derby over the weekend, this seems like it's quite timely. The pantheon of horse racing in the United States, of course, is a Triple Crown. Horse has to win 3 races, 3 different distances, different tracks, over just 5 weeks. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. In 2008, 3 years ago, along came a beautiful young colt named Big Brown. He won the Kentucky Derby by 4 3/4 lengths. He went on to the Preakness, the second race, and was stronger still. Won that by 5 1/4 lengths. In fact, the jockey eased him coming down the stretch because he was so far ahead of the other horses. So he's 1 race away from horse racing immortality. And he had a trainer, by the way, a guy named Rick Dutrow, who's gotten himself into some hot water recently. But Rick Dutrow was great as an author because almost everything he said was completely quotable. So I have a whole list of Rick Dutrow quotes, but I'm just going to share the one that you need to see, which is, "It's a foregone conclusion that my horse is going to win the Triple Crown." He had 0 doubt in his mind that it was a done deal. And by the way, the handicappers weren't too far behind him. Big Brown went off at 3 to 10 odds, which if you work out the math is about a 77% probability. So the last race is the Belmont. It's in New York. If anybody remembers this, June of 2008, it was a very hot and steamy day, but attendance doubled because people wanted to see history made. And Big Brown made history, all right. It just wasn't what everybody expected. He was the first Triple Crown contender ever to finish dead last in the last leg of the Triple Crown. After about a mile, he decided he'd had enough for the day, sort of sauntered off to the side. The jockey actually technically eased him, and he was done. By the way, next day, the veterinarians give him a full physical from his nose to his tail. He's fine. He just took the day off. Just wasn't a very good day to take off. By the way, I called my handicapper buddy, Steve and Chris. I said, Steve, can you explain this? And he says, you know, sometimes people forget we're talking about horses here. So what is the lesson? This is the first idea, and I think, by the way, this is an extraordinarily powerful concept in all aspects of decision-making. It's something called the inside versus the outside view. It's widely associated with Danny Kahneman, who you see here. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics, even though he's a psychologist and has never taught or even taken an economics class in his whole life. What is this idea? The inside view says the way we typically solve problems, by the way, this is all of us, the way we typically solve problems is we gather lots of information about the problem, as Crystal mentioned, we combine it with our own inputs, and then we forecast into the future. And that could be, as a student, when am I going to hand in my term paper? As a company, when are we going to launch our new products? It doesn't matter. Inside view is how we all think about our future problems. The outside view, by contrast, thinks about our problems as an instance of a larger reference class. It poses the question, when other people have been in this situation before, what happened? It allows us to use then some distributions and statistical methods to better understand our prospects. It's a very unnatural way to think, precisely because you have to leave aside this cherished information that you've gathered, and you have to set aside for a moment your own points of view and prejudices. So now let me go back and revisit Big Brown using the inside versus the outside view. Now the inside view, as you've gathered, is he's a beautiful colt, he's undefeated, and he's got this trainer who's gushing about his prospects. The question now would be, what would the outside view tell us? Well, in this case, the question would be, when horses have been in the same situation as Big Brown, what happened? So you can see, since the late 1800s, about 29 horses were in that position. 11 of those succeeded. So 11 over 29 is about a 40% success rate. Okay, his odds seem high, but not too crazy. But you see an incredible distinction before and after 1950. Before 1950, 8 of the 9 horses that tried succeeded. It's almost a 90% success rate. But since 1950, only 3 of 20 had succeeded, a 15% success rate. And by the way, none had done it since 1978. So all of a sudden, Big Brown's odds seem a little bit tougher than what's intimated by the tote board. Now, your response to this might be, wait a second, maybe Big Brown's just a really fast horse. Maybe he deserves those odds because he is so good and so exceptional. Well, there's a way we can measure that as well. It's something called a Beyer speed figure. It's basically the performance of the horse adjusted for track conditions and other factors. All you need to know really is the higher the speed figure, the faster is the horse. Here is Big Brown stacked up versus the last 6 failed Triple Crown aspirants, and you can see he looks downright lead-hoofed compared to these other horses. So now we have 2 interesting pieces of information from the outside view. One is a 15% success rate in the last 60 years or so, and a horse that's actually not that good. Now I want to be crystal clear. Big Brown was the favorite to win that race. He was probably a legitimate 30 to 40% probability to win. But at 77%, he's a massive underlay. People are betting too much on his prospects, and again, mostly because of the inside view. Now, the question you want to follow up with is, why do we do this? Why, as human, do we naturally go to the inside view? And the answer is, psychologists study this, the answer is we tend to fall for 3 specific types of illusions. The first is called the illusion of superiority, which is people think of themselves as better than the people around them. You've all heard these things before. If you survey people, you say, are you in the top half of all drivers? 80% of people will say yes. You ask high school students how you're getting along with others, 85% will say above average. My favorite statistic on this, by the way, is 86% of Harvard Business School graduates say they're better looking than their classmates, which I'm sure is true, by the way. The second's called the illusion of optimism, which is we see our own futures as very bright and specifically brighter than those around us. So, for example, they go to college students, they say, all right, you're going to graduate from school and you're going to have, career and relationships and so forth, health. Do you understand all these things? Yeah, they go, yeah. So, now rate your prospects for above average health, above average career, above average relationships versus everybody else. And they consistently rate themselves as having very, very bright futures. So we tend to be very optimistic as we think about our own prospects. The final one's called the illusion of control. This is a particularly fascinating phenomenon, which is when we perceive ourselves in control of a situation, we deem our odds of success as much higher than they are objectively. So I'll give you one example, which I just love. They went to Las Vegas and they studied people playing craps. And it turns out when people want high numbers, they throw the dice really hard. And when they want low numbers, they... So you can remember that next time you're playing Yahtzee with the kids. But there's another experiment I want to tell you about this, which is great. This is done by Ellen Langer here at Harvard, a very famous psychologist. She went to a small business on Long Island, and they're going to play a lottery. They had 50 tickets. They're going to sell them each for $1. They put them all in a thing. They spin around. They pull it out. Whoever wins the $50, right? So the setup is absolutely very simple. But half the people, the subjects, they laid the tickets on the table, and they were allowed to pick the one that they wanted. So they were in control of the number they actually selected, whereas the other group, the other 25 people, were simply handed their ticket. So they were not in control. And the question is, the very fact of taking my ticket versus being handed my ticket, would that make any difference in people's assessment of the value of the ticket in their hand? So everybody's standing around, they're spinning the thing, they're about to play, and the researcher says, ho, time out for a second. Somebody else wants to play, and we only have 50 tickets. So we need to buy a ticket from someone who already has one. So they first go to the people who had no control of the situation, people who simply handed their ticket, and they say, how much are you be willing to sell your ticket back for? And on average, they said about $2. I guess a little premium for excitement, okay. Then they went to the people who had selected their tickets. These are when they had picked them off the table themselves, and they said, how much are you be willing to sell your ticket for? And they said on average, around $9. So mathematically, everybody knows it's the same probabilities. But somehow, the very fact that I was involved changes what I perceive to be my own probabilities. Now, the last thing, and by the way, this I'm hopeful also will resonate with many of you, is why do we do this? Why are we so bad at thinking statistically? And the answer is, we're human beings. And human beings react to stories. Your mother told you stories. You tell stories to your children. Stories are the currency of how we communicate with one another. I want to give you one example, an experiment from the world of medicine that really makes this crystal clear. Here's what they did. They went to people and they said, you've got this horrible disease with the following really bad symptoms, right? Very unpleasant. And they said, you're going to have two treatment alternatives. Alternative one, which you can always go to, is 50-50. So no matter what, you always have a coin toss that this is going to work for you. Alternative two, they gave people options. It was 30, 50, 70, or 90% effectiveness, combined with an anecdote that was positive, negative, or neutral. Right? So I hope I'm making this clear. So you're going to be getting 30% positive, you're getting 50% neutral, right? Everybody's getting different arrays. And the question is, when presented with an anecdote or a statistic, which is going to be more salient in people's decisions? And here I'm just showing sort of the summary of this. It turns out when you have a positive anecdote, people will pick the 30% effectiveness. Now again, 30 versus 50, they're picking the 30% effectiveness 8 out of 10 times. And if you have a negative anecdote, they're picking the 90% effectiveness. Again, 90 versus 50, they're picking the 90 only 40% of the time. The stories swamp the statistics as people think about these kinds of problems. And by the way, you can relate to this yourself. Let's say you want to go buy a new car, right? Some of you may have had this experience, and you do all your research on the internet, and you decide what you want. It really seems to be right. You come into work, you mention it to a colleague, and the colleague says, oh yeah, I had a buddy who had one of those. He had all these problems with it. Now all of a sudden, even though tens of thousands of people had this car with no problem, your colleague's buddy, is casting doubt on your decision. So this is the first idea, the inside versus the outside view, and obviously the recommendation is quite clear. When appropriate, seek a proper outside view and apply that to your decision making, and often you'll see that that tempers and in many cases improves the quality of your decisions. Let me turn to the second mistake, and I also think something that's probably relevant for your world. And this is the false sense that we as humans can manage complex systems. Now, you could think about the world in two simple types of systems. One are sort of linear systems, clear-cut systems, where humans have had a lot of success in managing. And other are complex systems, non-linear systems, where cause and effect are fuzzy, where humans have done a very poor job over the centuries. And by the way, classic examples would be ecosystems and economies, just to name two. Obviously, the same root indicates this notion of complexity. So to try to make this more tangible, I want to tell you a very quick story about Yellowstone National Park. But by the way, the problem seemed to have started around the late 1800s. Turns out that the game many people were going into the park and seeing that the game population was much lower than they would hoped. It's a 2.2 million acre park, huge, but it turned out hunters and poachers had really reduced the game population. By the way, the U.S. cavalry was brought in 1886 to try to ameliorate this problem. And this started this series of events. By the way, I show you Teddy Roosevelt here because it turns out not only when he was president, but even well before that in the 1800s, Roosevelt was very, very committed to preservation of all the parks and specifically Yellowstone. So he's very closely associated with Yellowstone Park. So here's what the game wardens and the folks from the cavalry did. They took very special care to feed the game, and particularly the elks. So the elk population was given all sorts of extra food, and as you might expect in this situation, the elk population then took off. It started to thrive. However, unanticipated by the managers of this whole process, the elk population then got too big and started to eat essential flora and cause a lot of soil erosion. And specifically, for example, the elk ate all the aspen trees. And the aspen trees are what the beavers used to make beaver dams. So the beavers, then, their population plummeted. And so fewer beaver dams meant less ability to capture runoffs from the spring, which meant the trout couldn't spawn anymore. So it was this cascading series of events that was, again, with the best of intentions, really trying to improve the park, led to this series of events going on. So here's what ended up happening. You can see sort of this pattern is that the elk population, this is from the late 1800s, you can see it sort of peaked in 1914 as these elk were getting this very special treatment. And then, by the way, specifically the winter of 1919 to 1920 was horrific for the elk population. About 60% of them died, in part because of starvation, in part because of disease. However, the park managers, rather than acknowledging that their overfeeding and overpopulation was the problem, then believed that their issue was not the overpopulation, but rather the predators in the park, the mountain lions, the wolves, the coyotes, and so forth. So it turns out they systematically turned to killing the predators in the park, often illegally, by the way, and often illicitly. You may have heard this story, but the last wolf, for example, was shot in 1926 in Yellowstone Park. The wolves were then reintroduced 70 years later, but by the mid-1900s, basically the whole predator population had been wiped out of Yellowstone National Park. So there's a fascinating book that was written about this by a guy named Alston Chase. The book is called Playing God in Yellowstone. You can see the quote he says. They've been playing God for 95 years, and everything they did seemed to make the park worse. In their attempts to manage this beautiful wild area, each mistake made the park worse off, and no mistake could be corrected. Now, what I want to emphasize here is these are people with very favorable, there's nothing malicious here, very favorable intentions. They were trying to make the world a better place. They just were unable to read the consequences of initial actions and how they would cascade through events. So the second mistake is this idea of being very humble in managing complex systems and recognizing that even the best intentioned moves can have consequences that are very difficult to read. Let me wrap up with a third mistake, and this is an undue focus or belief in the value of experts. Now, I want to be really clear again. I think that experts have their place in the world, but in my view, they've been vastly overrated. By the way, there was a survey of Fortune 1000 executives, and over half of them said that intuition's the primary way they make their decisions. I find that to be absolutely frightening, by the way, if that's true. But this relates to this point. So let me introduce this with a story of Jim Sirwicki. He wrote this wonderful book called The Wisdom of Crowds. Many of you may have seen this a few years ago. And as part of his book tour, he was invited into the large electronics retailer Best Buy. And he gave him a speech, which, as best as I can gather, was not particularly warmly received. His speech was, basically, a bunch of your fairly uninformed employees can probably predict your sales more effectively than your seasoned staff. So, as I said, the message kind of plunked, but there was a guy in the audience that day, Jeff Sieverts, who said, this is kind of interesting. I'm going to give this a whirl. So after Sirwicki left and the room cleared out, he decided to run a couple trials. And the first was working on February 2005 gift card sales, right? Not a very big part of their business, not that important seasonally. He did this all via email, but it turns out when he tabulated the results, the crowd smoked their official forecast. So he's like, all right, kind of interesting, but, tentative. So he said, let's take this up a couple notches, and now we're going to work on 2005 holiday sales. Now, this is important for them, right, because they're an electronics retailer, holiday season's so big. Now he did this through the intranet. They had hundreds of people participate. And when the dust settled in early 2006, they found that their official forecast was off by 7%, but the crowd was off by 0.1%. Now, in doing research for the book, I called Sieverts and I was like, hey, how's it going, man? What's new? And he said, well, we were so encouraged by some of those results that we've started an internal market called Tag Trade, which you can see there. And we've been running these experiments for a long time. And by and large, they've been pretty good. Our experts don't always lose to the crowds. The crowds sometimes do worse. But by and large, it's certainly been a very useful source of information. He says, but there's another issue that's even more interesting, which is notwithstanding that our management sees these good predictions coming in from the crowds, they somehow just don't trust it. There's a fundamental misgiving about throwing our problems to the crowd. And they'd much rather have the person with the pinstripe suit and the PowerPoint slide walking through what's going to happen. Right? And you could probably appreciate that in all sorts of environments, that same situation holds true. So this is what I like to call the expert squeeze. I think this is something we're going to see a multi-generational process. Experts are in the middle, and again, they're going to have a role, but they're getting squeezed from both sides. On the left, they're getting squeezed by algorithms and computers. By the way, this tends to be problems that are fairly static, that are linear. Experts tend to be pretty good at these problems, but computers are faster, quicker, cheaper. And on the right are problems that are complex problems, highly probabilistic, many degrees of freedom, and what we know is crowds do better than the experts. Now, on the left, I have to give the recent example, of course, is Watson, the computer that beat the guys in Jeopardy, right? How awesome was that? Absolutely amazing that they were able to do this over a few-year period. And nobody heard the story of what they're going to do next with Watson. It turns out, obviously, they spent all tens of millions of dollars on this thing. So what is the next thing? So there was an interesting story. One of the chief scientists developing Watson developed a really painful tooth. I think it's a phenomenon, they call it like dead tooth syndrome or something like that. So it really, really hurt. So he went into the dentist, and the dentist gives him x-rays and checks them all out. He says, I have no idea. You look okay to me. He says, you should go see a neurologist. So he goes to a neurologist, guy gives him full physical. He says, this guy says, beats me, you look fine to me, right? Nothing I see. And it turns out this guy, just doing repeated searches, bumped into something where it turns out there's some nerve in your shoulder that if it's tweaked a different way, creates this thing called dead tooth syndrome. So he found it on his own, but notice the dentist didn't know about it. The neurologist didn't know about it. And he's like, that's the kind of problem that Watson would definitely be able to figure out, right? Because you got a huge amount of sample in there, and Watson gives you these answers with probabilities attached to them. So medical diagnosis is one example where Watson could be really, really cool. So that's going to obviously impinge to a large degree on the world of experts. On the right-hand side are crowds, and the wisdom of crowds. I've already alluded to this. Let me just say this, that what we do, I think, know quite well is that crowds will be better than experts in forecasting when certain conditions are in place. It's not always true, as we know from stock markets, booms and crashes, but when certain conditions are in place, it's going to work. And if you can create those circumstances, you'll tend to do fine. Let me wrap up with a couple final thoughts. Ellie's discussion this morning about a little discussion about using data versus intuition. This is, I think, an essentially important point. When does intuition work, and when does it not work? By the way, the subtitle of Think Twice is Harnessing the Power of Counterintuition. By the way, the best of my knowledge, counterintuition is actually not a word. I looked it up in the dictionary, but it is publisher said that was okay. But the question I always get is, well, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Blink. And Blink is talking about how great intuition is. And you're saying the power of counterintuition. What's going on? How do you reconcile these two views? Here's how I'd like to think about this. Psychologists like to talk about two systems of the mind, which they've creatively labeled System 1 and System 2. Exactly. System 1 is called your experiential system. It's fast, it's automatic, and it's very difficult to train. If you're walking down on a hike and you see a snake and you jump, that's your System 1. If you answered 10 cents for the bat and ball question, which I hoped you did, that was your System 1. Yelling the answer in your ear, right? It just pops into your head automatically. System 2, by contrast, is your analytical system. It's slow, it's purposeful, it's deliberate, but it's something that you can train over time. So here's the key with intuition. Whenever we start an activity, let's say chess playing is a good example, you always start in System 2. Remember when you first learned to play chess, or you watch a little kid, they're biting their tongue, they're trying to think about how the different pieces move, right? They're really thinking about very explicitly what they should do. Or you think about the first time you learned to drive a car. But if you play chess enough, thousands and thousands of hours, and you become a master or grandmaster, as you know, chess masters are incredibly intuitive. You show them the board, and they know instantly which player has the advantage. And you turn to the other side, and they can find either optimal or close to optimal moves in seconds. Why? Because their practice is internalized from System 2 into System 1, and now they see the salient features. Here's the key. For your intuition to work, the system you're dealing with must be stable and linear. Stable means the basic parameters of the activity don't change. The chessboard has 8 by 8. Every time we play, the pieces move the same way. Linear means cause and effect are always linked in the same way. If I flick it this way, it's always going to have the same perturbation will lead to the same outcome. Stable and linear intuition, bring it on. It's fantastic. Unstable and nonlinear, be very careful. We're natural pattern seekers, and we're going to see patterns where they don't exist. So the application of intuition is going to be this continuum. Some places perfectly applicable, other places be very, very careful. Okay, so let's just, penultimate point. What do we want to do when you walk out tomorrow or next few days? What can you do differently to improve the quality of your decisions? There are 3 things I would say. Number 1, by the way, which is cheap and easy and nobody does it, is maintain a decision-making journal. Even if you're working in a committee or board level, have someone document the decisions. Write down what you decided, why you decided, if there are dissenting views, that they are understood. By the way, if you're doing this for yourself, I would recommend writing down how you feel. How do you feel physically? How do you feel emotionally? And keep track. The reason this is so important is we all fall for something called hindsight bias. Once the events have unfolded, we think we knew what was going to happen with a much higher probability than we actually did. But if you've written this down by hand, or it's in the board notes, documented, you can't fool yourself. It's one of the mechanisms to give yourself really, really good feedback. And then you review your journal periodically to make sure that you're constant. And by the way, I promise you, if you keep one of these things for 3 months or 6 months and you look back, you'll be appalled at the things you believed 3 months ago. You'll be appalled. So it's this dynamic process. And by the way, what we all do is we navigate, our brains navigate, so we always look good. Second thing is creating a checklist. By the way, here in Boston, there's a wonderful surgeon and writer, Atul Gawande. He wrote a book a year and a half ago called The Checklist Manifesto, which is a wonderful book about the application of checklists across various domains. There's a line in the back of the book which I absolutely love, and he said, domain after domain after domain, aviation, medicine, construction, investing, where people have properly implemented checklists, the outcomes have improved without any improvement in the underlying skill of the users. Let me say that again. The outcomes have improved without any underlying skill. I don't need my people to be smarter. I don't need them to be better trained. I just need them to execute more effectively than they are. So there are all sorts of reasons people don't like checklists, many of them because they feel that they're quite demeaning, but everywhere they've been implemented correctly, they've had extraordinary results, very cost-effective results. So the question you might ask is, in my organization, can I or should we create a checklist? And if we don't have one, why don't we? It may not lend itself to all parts of what you do, but for many parts it will. Last thing I'll mention is this idea called the pre-mortem. Everybody knows about a post-mortem, right? We made a decision, it didn't turn out so well. We all sit around, what did we know at the time? Why did it go bad? And we give ourselves feedback, and we go, okay, great, done. Pre-mortem is a very different idea. It says before we actually make a decision, so we're not emotionally attached to it yet, before we make a decision, let's launch ourselves into the future. Let's say 12 months. So it's May 2012, or 2 years, May 2013. We made the decision, it turned out badly. Now, each of us independently, let's write down why the decision didn't work out. And it turns out when people go through that exercise, again, they've not committed emotionally to the decision yet, but they're just documenting. When they do that, they come up with up to 30% more alternatives than somehow if they're just standing in the present looking into the future. So somehow this gymnastics of putting yourself into the future, looking back, without having made the decision, opens up your mind versus in the present, looking forward. It's called a pre-mortem. It's a very interesting technique. It was developed by a guy named Gary Klein, and I think it's gaining a lot more traction, and it should. It's a really cool idea. So let me finish with this. The 3 big ideas. Number 1 is smart people do dumb things. It doesn't matter what your IQ is. In fact, I can show you some of the greatest and most horrendous mistakes ever are by people who objectively have the highest IQs. What matters is your rationality quotient, your ability to make decisions. And in order to do that effectively, you have to prepare your mind. You have to learn about the kinds of mistakes you're going to make. You have to recognize those potential mistakes in the context they appear. They're going to be in your professional life. They're going to be in your personal life. They'll be while you're watching the news or watching a ball game on TV. And then you have to take concrete steps to mitigate those mistakes, to deal with them in your organization or deal with them personally. Second is, recognize when you need to think twice. I don't want to have everybody, I always say to people, when you go to Starbucks, by heaven, you don't need to bring the book with you, right? Just order, there's nothing too complicated. But when you find that the stakes are sufficiently high and you're in one of these decision-making danger zones, you must absolutely think twice. And that may be bringing family members or colleagues or what have you in order to make sure that you're doing things properly. And the third thing I want to say is it's all ultimately about opportunity. There are a lot of great decision-making books, and they have the same sort of tone, which is, we economists have studied how people should make decisions rationally, and we've determined, psychologists, that people are way below what they're supposed to be doing. And so you, chump, are down here, right? And you kind of walk away, oh, that's not good. Okay, that's all true, by the way. But the goal here is if we can understand these kinds of situations, and more importantly, if we can take steps to deal with it, it's going to present opportunities. And the analogy I would use is just like playing tennis, right? If anybody's a weekend tennis player, if you simply reduce the number of unforced errors that you make, instead of zinging it down the line, you just hit it back in, you're going to fewer unforced errors, you're going to be much more happy with the score at the end. And this is really the same idea here. Fewer unforced errors leading to more satisfactory results.